Welcome to another installment of History of. I'm your host, Dano Dillinger, bringing you another in-depth look at the history of quintessential Americana. If you're new here, please tap that subscribe button and be sure to hit the bell so you don't miss a single installment. Today, we'll be discussing the history of the US dollar. In order to properly tell the roller coaster tale that is the story of the US dollar, we have to first explain why it's called a dollar to begin with. Back in the year 1519, when Bohemian Count Hieronymus Schlick discovered a rich mine of silver near his estate in the Joachimsthal Valley, modern-day Czech Republic, he decided to mint his own coins. Named for the valley in which they were mined, they were called Joachimsthalers, or thalers for short. The big silver coins became so popular across the world that the word thalers became synonymous with any heavy silver coin, from the Italian talero to the Ethiopian talari, all the way to the US dollar. Fast forward to 1700s London, where the British Empire was intent on keeping as much gold and silver inside the island of Great Britain as possible, so much so that they actually outlawed the export of the currency, known as pounds and shillings, even to their own colonies such as Bermuda, India, Ireland, and America, just to name a few. The embargo on the British pound left the American colonists to rely on currency that was minted in other countries, and the country with the most plentiful supply of minted coins was Mexico, where Spain was producing a daunting amount of silver coins from the Casa de Moneda de Mexico, established in 1535 and still operating today as the oldest active mint in the Americas. The silver coins produced from Mexico were called pesos and held a value of 8 Spanish reals, which is why pirates would commonly refer to silver coins as pieces of 8. However, to the American colonists, they were simply referred to as dollars. The dollar sign itself is rumored to have also originated from the Mexican peso, whereas the abbreviation for peso, PS, was combined into a scrunched shorthand by hurried bookkeepers to create the symbol we instantly recognize as the dollar sign. During this time, despite the over-minting of silver pesos that made their way into the colonies, most of the coinage ended up back in Europe as they were used by colonists to pay for imported goods and never made their way back to the colonies. In 1729, Benjamin Franklin noticed the lack of currency in Philadelphia was wreaking havoc on the local economy, which prompted him to pen an anonymous pamphlet titled A Modest Inquiry into the Necessity of a Paper Currency. Franklin's advocacy for a paper currency landed him contracts for printing money for the colony of Pennsylvania. The notes featured a famous Franklin quote, "Mind your business," in place of what we would now see as, "In God we trust." The Crown of England saw these paper currency notes as impudence to its authority, and by 1764, the British Parliament had outlawed the printing, distribution, and use of any and all paper currency in America. This was just one of many discrepancies which ultimately led to the US revolting against the Crown of England. However, revolution requires conscription, and conscripts require arms, kit, supplies, and food, all of which cost money, the likes of which we had none. On June 22, 1775, the Continental Congress passed and began issuance of the paper continental currency, also known as continentals. Continentals were valued at 1-to-1 with the Spanish peso, but as millions and millions of continentals were printed, their value fell dramatically to the point where they were literally not worth the paper they were printed on, coining the phrase "not worth a continental" to describe things that were of little or no value. Though the American Revolution became the first war in history financed and won off the back of paper money, it left the American citizens feeling betrayed, as the money in their pocket was literally worthless. The Founding Fathers decided to avoid the controversial issue of paper money by leaving it out of the Constitution altogether, and it was almost another 100 years before the federal government would print paper money again. With the Coinage Act of 1792, the United States officially named the dollar as the national currency, ditching the confusing imperial system of pounds, shillings, pence, and farthings. The dollar was to be evenly divided 100 equal ways. Thomas Jefferson coined the term cents, from the Latin for 100. This radical idea made the US dollar the first currency in the world that could be represented using decimals. The first coins were minted in the Philadelphia US Mint, established April 2, 1792, which was also the first federal building in America, predating both the Capitol building and the White House. The first coins minted at the Philadelphia Mint did not portray images of leaders, politicians, or statesmen, as the new nation had just rid itself of the plague of imperial monarchy and elitism. So the Founding Fathers thought it best for the money to use symbolism that represented ideas such as liberty, victory, and freedom, rather than individuals. That precedent would remain unchanged for almost 100 years until we would start printing paper money again around the time of the Civil War. But that was only the temporary end of federal paper money in young America. Wildcat banking was the issuance of currency in the United States by privately organized, state-chartered banks. Wildcat banks were banks of issue rather than deposit banks. Their business focused on providing a medium of exchange to support the needs of local commerce, especially in coinage-poor areas. They focused on this rather than the management of funds. Their notes represented claims on the assets of the bank, which were typically a portfolio of real estate or marketable securities. At the time, the Democratic Party opposed any government involvement in banking, and Supreme Court rulings established that states could authorize currency issues only on the credit of private parties rather than that of the state. This led to hundreds of different notes from different banks in different states, each with a different look and value. Lists were actually published to help bankers and others to identify and appraise these easily counterfeited notes. These wildcat banks flourished alongside more centralized state banks during the free banking era from 1837 to 1865, when the country had no national currency. Railroads and other capital-intensive businesses might, in the absence of an alternative, establish a bank to produce the money notes that they needed to carry on business, and state regulations were applied ineffectively, if even at all. Later, the National Bank Act of 1863 left currency issuance in the hands of these private banks, but imposed a tax on the state banknotes that was so high, it was cheaper for banks to remove them from circulation altogether. So they did. An anti-slavery senator from Ohio named Salmon P. Chase, who had earned his reputation as an attorney defending black fugitives from being sent back to their captors in the South, had his sights set on becoming president. But in 1861, Chase lost the Republican presidential nomination to the more moderate Abraham Lincoln. After Lincoln was elected president, in a show of good faith to the more radical edge of the Republican Party, Lincoln appointed Chase as Secretary of Treasury. As Secretary, Chase alone was authorized to act on all matters pertaining to the country's finances. It was under the leadership of Chase that the government began printing paper money again in order to finance the Union Army. In a shameless pursuit of clout, Chase saw fitting to adorn the first U.S. $1 bill with the likeness of his ideal American president, himself. The U.S. Treasury printed over $400 million worth of paper notes, which came to be referred to as greenbacks, due to the green ink used to print the reverse side of the note, designed to differentiate the notes from state-chartered banknotes of the day, which typically were blank on the reverse side. As with continental currency, greenbacks depreciated as more and more were printed, so much that in the end, they were only worth about 1/3 of their face value. Meanwhile, in the South, the Confederate States dollar, commonly referred to as the grayback to distinguish itself from the northern United States greenback, was first issued just before the outbreak of the American Civil War by the newly formed Confederate States of America. The first series of Confederate paper money, issued in March 1861, bore interest and had a total circulation of $1 million. As the war began to tilt against the Confederacy, confidence in the currency diminished, and the government inflated the currency by continuing to print the grayback notes. The Confederacy printed upwards of $1 billion worth of graybacks. Their value dropped so significantly as a result that in just 4 short years, by 1865, a $10 Confederate bill could only buy about 2 cents worth of goods. On a side note, during this time in Louisiana, where banking laws were sound and the state banknotes were respected across the southern states, Deese notes from the Citizens Bank of Louisiana were widely known and accepted by merchants and shopkeepers in the Confederate States. These $10 notes used the French word for 10, dix, D-I-X, on the back. These popular DIX notes were often referred to as Dixies, and may have led to the term Dixieland, and some would argue how the Confederate South generally became known as the Land of Dixie. Neither graybacks nor greenbacks could be exchanged for gold or silver. Their value was based solely on the promise that the government would redeem them once their side won the war. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General-in-Chief Robert E. Lee tendered his unconditional surrender to the commanding general of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, and by May 9th of the same year, the Confederacy had folded entirely, leaving the North victorious and the grayback and Dixie notes rendered worthless pieces of paper. Meanwhile, the greenback had become such an entrusted standard that most people didn't even bother redeeming them after the war, and America was once again a country of federally regulated paper money. In 1870, now Supreme Court Justice Salmon P. Chase ironically claimed that the federal government had no constitutional right to force citizens to use paper money, and that the Legal Tender Act of 1861 violated the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution in the Hepburn v. Griswold ruling, effectively ruling against his own actions from when he was Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury. Just prior to Chase's ironic ruling, his face had been replaced on the $1 bill with the face of founding father and first United States President George Washington. Many speculate that this bruised Chase's ego and prompted his 1870 ruling, which was overturned in the Knox v. Lee ruling of 1871. Salmon P. Chase died in 1873, but would leave one more mark on U.S. paper currency in the year of 1918 when his portrait was depicted on the $10,000 bill, which was the largest bill intended for general circulation. From the 1870s up until World War II, the US dollar notes received several facelifts with the exception of the $1 note and the $2 note, which remained essentially the same throughout our history, featuring George Washington on the $1 bill and Thomas Jefferson on the $2. The $5 bill, for instance, saw the portrait of a Native American chief, which was replaced by the portrait of Abraham Lincoln, and then replaced with the portrait of General Ulysses S. Grant, then back to Lincoln, then Andrew Jackson, followed by Alexander Hamilton, who was depicted on the original greenback note prior to the 1870s, then Lincoln again, Grant again, and finally Lincoln in 1914, where he would remain through today. The Federal Reserve System is the central banking system of the United States of America. It was created on December 23, 1913, with the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act. Due to this change, two main types of notes were created during this time frame: Federal Reserve notes and United States notes. The difference between a United States note and a Federal Reserve note is that a United States note represented a bill of credit, and since it was issued by the government itself and did not involve either lending or borrowing, was inserted by the Treasury directly into circulation free of interest. As where a Federal Reserve note is a note printed at the instruction of the Board of Governors and the 12 Federal Reserve member banks. As such, Federal Reserve notes could potentially be backed by borrowed money or tied-up equity. Most of the denominations of the US notes have undergone multiple facelifts for a multitude of reasons, namely counterfeit and fraud protection, as well as special series runs of the bills such as the iconic Silver Certificate series. A silver certificate was a form of paper currency which was issued by the US government beginning in 1878. It represented a stated amount of silver bullion, enabling individuals to buy the commodity without taking physical possession of it. They were discontinued in 1964 but are still in circulation today, although rare and are only redeemable at face value as legal tender. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed into law a bill declaring "In God We Trust" to become the nation's official motto. Under this legislation, Congress further mandated that the phrase be printed in capital letters on every denomination of U.S. paper currency. "In God We Trust" first appeared on the silver certificate in 1957, followed by other certificates. Federal Reserve notes and United States notes were circulated with the motto starting in 1964, with some notes gaining the motto as late as 1966. After World War II, America emerged as a global economic power. Our economy was considered so stable that in 1945, the US dollar replaced the British pound sterling as the global reserve currency, meaning that banks and governments worldwide kept more US dollars on hand than any other foreign forms of currency, and used it as the benchmark for their own currency's value. This was largely due to the US dollar being backed by precious metals like gold and silver. Throughout the 20th century, the US dollar's relationship with precious metals grew weaker and weaker until it was severed completely in 1971 under the administration of President Richard Nixon during the Nixon shock. The Nixon shock was a series of economic measures undertaken by President Nixon in 1971 in response to increasing inflation, the most significant of which were wage and price freezes, surcharges on imports, and the unilateral cancellation of the direct international convertibility of the United States dollar to gold, making the US dollar become what is referred to as a freely floating fiat currency. A fiat currency does not have intrinsic value. It has value only because a government maintains its value or because parties engaging in exchange agree on its value, meaning its value is based only on its people's faith in their government, which is an inherently risky endeavor, but it does give Congress more power and flexibility to deal with economic crisis. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, Congress was able to print more money for the US stimulus package without restriction because the money itself is just paper that holds value only because the government says it does. And we all collectively trust that it is what the government says it is. This is why, since the Nixon shock, the imagery on all US dollar notes unified to depict only faces of trustworthy people, in an attempt to inspire trust within the systems such as presidents, statesmen, and treasury secretaries. In fact, the Secretary of Treasury has the final say on who is depicted. The only prerequisite to be featured on a US note is that you be a person whose place in history is well known by the general population. However, in keeping with our anti-totalitarian roots, living people are strictly prohibited from being featured on any US note. The most recent proposed change came when the Department of Treasury released in 2016 that they plan to replace President Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill with slavery abolitionist and Underground Railroad founder Harriet Tubman. However, in 2019, the Trump administration announced that the change would be delayed upwards of 10 years. The currency of the United States is a utilitarian object in that it is a man-made tool that, although has been essentially unchanged during our lifetime, can and has on multiple occasions changed and morphed to meet the needs of the current situation of our society. The dollar and currency in general is a bizarre phenomenon in terms of psychology in that it is often the cause of both stress and hope within our lives, often being taken for granted by us as a static definitive, but in reality, at this point in time, it's entirely made up, as precious as gold to us while subsequently as worthless as sand. In fact, you can buy bags of worthless sand and pay for them with equally worthless pieces of paper called dollars. But they're not entirely worthless. Without the dollar, we couldn't have had independence. Without the dollar, we wouldn't have won World War II. Without the dollar, we wouldn't be worth a continental.